In this lecture, we are going to talk about functions in Python. Functions, or methods as they are sometimes called, are a group of code or a group of statements that are executed together atomically or using one command or one call to the function. In Bash and in other languages, you may be used to writing functions like this. Perhaps the keyword function followed by the function name, then a pair of curly braces, and you type in the function. In Python, as well as Ruby, these are called definitions. So you type def for definition, then the function name, let's say for example say hello. Then of course you open a code block as you did with all other language constructs that needed a code block. You open a colon, then you type whatever you want the function to do. So let's say for example print hello. That is a function, and the code like this will not work unless you call it. You have to call the function in order for it to work. So say hello. And the function optionally can take parameters. So you add here a double parenthesis like this, in which you can optionally provide parameters for the function. Those parameters are immediately available to the body of the function, so you can use it to process input from the user or from the calling code. Now let's first execute this code like this. Okay, the function works. Say hello does print the hello string to the screen. Okay, so let's quickly move to a real-world example. Let's say that you want to authenticate users on the system using a function so that you don't have to retype the code whenever a user needs access. So let's quickly create a dictionary of users. Okay, so we have here usernames or users. Let's call those users. Have a name, you have a privilege, you have a password. You have a name, you have a privilege, and you have a password. Okay, now we need to create a function that is going to authenticate those users. So authenticate, and in order to authenticate, you will need naturally two things or two strings, the username and the password. So I'm going to ask the function to accept two parameters, a username and a password, and then I will loop through the usernames that I have, or the users list that I have. So for you, for user, in users, then open a code block. If you name is equal to the username, we've seen code like this before. We are just incorporating dictionaries, lists, and functions to make it more real-world-like. So if the username is the username that is supplied and the password is the password that was supplied, return true. Return is what the function gives to the calling code. A function may return nothing, but often you will need the function to return something to the calling code. This return can be a value, it can be a Boolean value, it can be a string or an integer or whatever, it can be an object, it can be anything, a list, a dictionary. It's just a result of the processing that has been done. So more often than not, you will need to return something from your functions. In this case, I'm returning true if the user has been authenticated. And notice here that the return statement will automatically break the loop. It's gonna exit from the function. The return automatically exits from the function. So if you are worried about if you have like 1,000 users here and you are looping through these users until you find the correct username and password, you don't have to search the rest of the list needlessly and waste your CPU resources searching for a username that has been already found. Don't worry, the return statement will immediately break from the loop and break from the function and go to the calling code with the Boolean value of true to inform the calling code that yes, a username with the username supplied and a password have been found in the database, and of course this user should be authenticated. Otherwise, we should return false by default. This means that if this loop is complete without having a username or a password, whether because there is no username or password with the strings that have been supplied, or they have been supplied incorrectly, in all cases you will have to return false at the end. Okay, and of course there is a colon here because this is an if statement. And that is how you authenticate your users. So let's try out this code. Let's call authenticate, give it a username. Let's see what we have here. We have B. Cranston and Egon. Let's try John Doe, our username that have been used throughout this course, and pass 1, 2, 3. And let's put this in an if statement. So if authenticate JDoe and pass 1, 2, 3, let's print welcome to the application, whatever welcome message you want to print. Perhaps this will open a screen or open another program for the user, or whatever action you want to do if the user is authenticated. Otherwise, else print sorry, wrong, or non-existent credentials, or any message that will inform the user that he or she has entered incorrect credentials. Let's run this code now. Okay, sorry, wrong, or non-existent credentials, of course, because John Doe or JDoe and pass 1, 2, 3 does not exist in this list of users. Let's enter a user that does exist, B. Cranston, and a password of Millennium. Okay, like this. Now I have, okay, it was mistyped. Okay, let's run the code again. Welcome to the application. So this is how you can use a function to group code that can be used multiple times. This can be used anywhere in your code to authenticate users whenever you want, and to display a welcome message, or otherwise you can execute whatever command you want, execute it when the user is successfully authenticated. Okay. Now sometimes when you work with functions that are coming from third-party libraries, you will find that the README or the documentation of the library informs you that you have to call the function with something like this. So if the function is authenticate, you might find that they are asking you to type in the function like this: username equals and password equals. This is another way of running functions. It is, instead of relying on positional arguments. Now let's see. Authenticate here is accepting two arguments. The first one is username, the second one is password. So I can explicitly inform my function that the username that I'm passing is B. Cranston and the password is Millennium. The advantage of using this is not only you are informing yourself or the user of your function or the reader of your code what those parameters are there for, but you can also interchange their locations like this. So I can no longer be obliged to add them in a specific order. So I can put the password before the username as long as I am adding a key for my parameter. Now, if I run this code again, it will work as before. Welcome to the application. The user has been successfully authenticated because now the function is aware that the password is this one and the username is this one, regardless of their location. This is also very useful if you have a function that takes, like, for example, a dozen parameters. And believe me, yes, there are functions in third-party libraries and in existing libraries in Python that takes that number of arguments. So this way, it might be very confusing to remember the order of arguments, which comes before which. So it becomes very efficient to name your parameters like this, to add a name for your parameter in the function, so that you and the users of your code know why those parameters are used and why they are assigned those values. Okay, that was a brief introduction to functions. What if you want to add a positional argument, or in other words, you want to add an argument or a parameter to the function without placing a key? Of course, this might be a rare case, because if you want to use named parameters, why would you want to add a parameter without a name? But if you want to, if this is the case, you can add it just at the start of the parameter list. You cannot add a positional argument after a named one. So let's say, for example, that I want to authenticate a user using the username, the password, and the privilege. So let's add priv here, like this. Now, if you want to add privilege, you will have to add it here, like this. For example, admin. So now I'm authenticating the user with the privilege, the user, and the password. I cannot add admin at the end here because this won't work. If I try to do that, the code is going to give me an error, as you can see here. Positional argument follows keyword argument. You have to put the positional argument before the keyword one, like this. Again, this is a not so common case because you would normally want to do something like this. Since you are following this pattern, since you are naming your variables or naming your parameters, it's a common sense to add a name for each and every parameter, not just to mix them. But if you want to mix them, you have to ensure that the keyword parameters come at last. Okay. Now, Python also allows you to add default parameters. Sometimes they are called optional parameters. Let's say, for example, that you want this privilege. As you can see here, I forgot to add the privilege, or because I omitted the privilege, and the privilege or the priv is part of the function design. So here it is expecting a third parameter that is called privilege. What if this third parameter is not needed? Or let's say I want it to be optional. If the user wants to add it, that's okay. If the user does not want to add it, that's also okay. So I can add priv and then I give it a default value like this, priv equals user. This means that if priv is defined here like this, it will be honored and it will be accepted by the function. So let's say that you are going to use this privilege inside the function for some reason, and by default it's user. So if the privilege is not supplied, it's gonna default to user. If it is supplied, the function is gonna take whatever is inside the privilege. So that is called an optional argument. And as you can see, if I removed this argument from the list of parameters that I'm passing the function will still run correctly. If I added it, it will also run normally without any problems. Okay, so that is called an optional parameter. Now let's move on to function arbitrary arguments. Sometimes you may not be sure about the number of arguments you want your function to handle. Let's say, for example, that you have a function that will find the product of whatever numbers passed to it. Let's, for a moment, leave the authentication and the users. Let's omit this code for the moment. Let's say that we have a function like this, function or def multiply. I'm going to call it multiply. And we're going to use this function to multiply whatever numbers passed to it. You don't know firsthand how many arguments the user will pass to the function at runtime, so you create a function as follows, multiply, and here we need an argument or a parameter that will accept any number of arguments passed to it. This can be easily done in Python by adding an asterisk before the parameter name. So I can add num preceded by an asterisk. This means that num is going to be translated inside the function to a list of parameters. No matter how many parameters the user will pass, they are all going to be stored inside this num list. So let's see now how this function may work. I can, for example, give a result of 1 and then start my loop for n in num, which is the list. Result is going to be multiply equal to n. And what this symbol does, it's just the same as doing this. Result equals result times n. Just going to multiply itself by whatever comes after it, result times n. This is a shortcut for this statement, result multiply equals n. So I'm gonna loop through every item or every number that the user passes, and I'm gonna multiply it by result again and again until I have the final, until the list is empty. All the parameters that the user has supplied are finished, and then I'm gonna return the final result for me. If the user entered nothing, then the result will always be 1. Let's see how this works first. So multiply, then let's give it just one number like 5, for example. And let's print the output. So print multiply 5. Of course, it's going to be 5. What about 5 and 8? It's going to be 40. What about 5 and 8 and 10? It's supposed to be 400. Yes. What about 5, 8, 10, and 45, for example? Let's go higher. You get the point. But what if I pass nothing? Let's try. And because I'm passing in an asterisk, this means that the function may accept nothing. The list may be empty, because if the list contains nothing, it can still be used in loop. All what's going to do is that for n in num, which is empty, result equals result times n, which is nothing, so the result will stay 1, and the result will be 1, which is of course not the best answer the user might get. So I can just add a little if condition here. If the length of num is 0, or in other words, if the null is empty, or if the user did not pass any arguments, just return 0, for example. Which makes sense if I am calling my function with 0 arguments. The reasonable result is just 0, like this. Okay? So that is how you can pass arbitrary arguments to a function. The function may accept any number of arguments. And as you can see, this is very common if you want to multiply numbers, for example. And if you want to mix arbitrary and positional arguments, this can be done in Python as long as the arbitrary items come as the last arguments. So let's say, for example, that I want to pass in a message to the function, a message that it's going to be supplied to the user. And this message is going to be like this: return message and result. Okay, so I can say the answer is, and then supply whatever items I want, 8, 5, 6, for example. Okay, and it's complaining because it's trying to add a string to an integer. So I can easily solve this by converting the result, which is an integer, to a string by using the str function, which will convert a number to a string. Now, if I run this code again, it's going to give me, let's just add a space here. The answer is 240. So here I could combine a positional argument, which is message, with an arbitrary number of arguments, which is whatever I pass after the message, and the function will correctly take the positional argument and add it to the result, and then use whatever was passed in the rest of the parameters as a list and multiply them together. Okay, so while this option in functions, in Python functions, are going to convert the parameters to a list, you can also have your parameters added as a key value pair, or in other words, a dictionary. Let's say you want a function that will create a user dictionary by accepting a number of arguments. So let's delete this function, and let's say that we want a function that's going to create a user. Let's return back to our basic example of users. Let's say that we want a function that will create a user like this: create user. And we have two obligatory arguments, which is the username and the password. And then we have a number of optional metadata that can be added to the user profile, like for example, the age, the job, the country, the preferred language, and so on. So if I added meta like this, it's going to be a list. So again, I will fall into the problem of having to remember the positions of the arguments. Let's demonstrate this. Let's keep it as an arbitrary number of arguments like we did before and see how we can do this. First, I will define an empty dictionary because this is the user that's going to be created. Let's just call it user, not result, to be more obvious to you. And then username will be the username that's supplied. User password will be the password that has been supplied. And then I want to add whatever metadata was supplied in the argument list. So if I looped like I did through the list of parameters, like for m in meta, I want to be able to add user and then some key and then equals the value of m. You see, now I need something. Now I need a name for the metadata that you want to add. I need a name for whatever property you want to add. Like for example, age is 30, job is DevOps. Okay, so I need this to be a dictionary instead of a list. To make the problem more obvious to you, let's say that I want to call this function create user, and I give it a name, which is Ahmed. I give it a password, which is ABC123, for example. And then I want to give it a list of arguments. Like for example, the job is DevOps engineer, the age is 30, and the country, for example, is US. Okay, so how would the code know that this is a job, this is the age, and this is the country? How I'm going to add this to the dictionary here, to the result, to the user? One way of doing this is to use the indexes. So if I know that the user is going to pass 3 parameters, I can use something like this. Comment out this code and can use something like this. User, this is the 0, this is the 1. So user 2 is meta 0. user 3 is meta 1, and so on. But you can see how this is becoming very, very confusing, and it can easily be error prone. This is not readable. This is not practical. So the correct way of doing this is to convert this argument list to a dictionary. This can be done in Python by adding another asterisk to the parameter. Now I can add this as a key value pair. So instead of adding DevOps engineer and 30 and US, I will add it as a dictionary like this. Job equals DevOps engineer, age equals 30, country equals US. Now I have access to those keys inside my code, inside my loop, as we learned in a previous lecture. When working with loops in dictionaries, I can just add k and v for key and value in meta, and user k for key is value. That's it. Now I can return the user. Okay, so now if the user equals create user and I add those parameters to the function, I can easily now print this user after it has been created, and it will contain the values that I have added, like this. Okay, I forgot here to add .items. This is mandatory if you want to loop through a dictionary. If you want to use the k and v, you have to add the items method to the dictionary. Otherwise, you can only loop through the keys. Okay, so now let's clear the screen and run the code again. Now we have a username created, username Ahmad, password ABC123, which is the mandatory parameters. And now we have all the metadata that we added to the profile, a job, an age, a country. I can add whatever I want to the end. Let's say language or lang, for example. This will automatically be added to the user when it's created, lang English. So now you get the point. So this is how we can add arbitrary arguments to functions. You can either add them as a list or as a dictionary or both. You can mix and match them however you want, as long as you add them with this order. The positional arguments first, then any named parameter, like for example privilege or any other named parameter, then arbitrary parameters that are converted to a list like this that we have seen before when we multiplied multiple items, then finally the key value parameters in which you can add them like you add a dictionary like this. So this is the correct way of ordering your parameters, ordering the priority of your parameters, so that you write correct Python code that does not produce errors. Okay, that was all for functions in Python. In the coming lecture, we are going to see how we can add functions to modules so that they can be imported and used in multiple Python files. So until next lecture, take care.